books portray Holmes as murdering the owners. The old man quickly vanished along with his wife. Myth, it's all a myth. The theories of him killing them are apparently inaccurate. Dr. Holton, the owner, was a fellow Michigan alumni and was only a few years older than Holmes, but he'd actually remained in Englewood throughout Holmes's life and survived well into the 20th century, so he was not a victim, nor was his wife. They're both very much alive. But anyway, this is important. He'd went on to purchase the empty lot across from the drugstore, where construction had began in 1887 for a 2-story mixed-use building with apartments on the second floor and retail spaces, including a new drugstore. Neat. A creditor of Holmes named John de Breuil had died of apoplexy on April 7th of 1891 in the drugstore, which is interesting. It's actually unknown if Holmes was involved with this or not, so we will never know. But Holmes had decided to never pay the architects or the steel company working on his building, Attn Iron and Steel, whom later sued him in 1888. But later on in 1892, he had added a 3rd floor to the building, telling investors and suppliers he intended to use it as a hotel during the upcoming World Columbians exposition. Though the hotel portion was never actually completed, it was somewhat completed, the 3 stories and basement, but it took quite a while. A lot of people say that he purposefully didn't pay them or would hire on new contractors, so whomever was helping build the building would not know the layout. It's not really written if that's fact or not. It's kind of just a theory that he wanted to have his little torture castle a complete secret to everyone, even those constructing it. So, the 1st floor was the storefront. The 2nd story consisted of elaborate torture rooms, which contained a chute that led to the basement. The 3rd floor held more apartment rooms, and these were all soundproofed, and a lot of the hallways were mazes, some of which seemed to go nowhere. A lot of the rooms were outfitted with chutes dropping into the basement, where Holmes would, and I kid you not, have acid vats, quicklime, and a crematorium at his disposal of his victims' bodies. So, furniture suppliers had actually found that Holmes was hiding their materials that he'd never paid for in hidden rooms and hidden passageways throughout the building. People had actually searched his hotel and it had made the news, and investors for the planned hotel had pulled out of the deal when a jeweler of the building showed them articles about this murderous castle. In 1894, some police officers actually inspected the hotel while Holmes was out. During the inspection, they had found rooms with hinged walls and false partitions, rooms linked with secret passageways, and even airtight rooms that were connected to presumably to fake a suicide to exonerate Holmes from being charged with attempted murder. Or, not attempted, murder. So, Holmes collected the insurance payout on the basis of his genuine corpse. He then went on to manipulate Paitzell's unsuspecting wife into allowing 3 of her 5 children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, to be in his custody. I know. The eldest daughter and the baby had remained with Mrs. Paitzell. Holmes and the 3 children had then went on to travel throughout northern United States and into Canada. Get out of my country. Very odd, I know. Simultaneously, he escorted Mrs. Paitzell along a parallel route, all while using various aliases to lie to her concerning her husband's death, claiming that he'd been hiding out in London for a bit. No, he was dead. So, he'd also lied to her about the whereabouts of her 3 children that he had with him, in Detroit, just prior to entering Canada, where they were actually only separated by a few blocks. Just really sad. In an even weirder move, though, he was staying at another location, Holmes, with his wife, who was completely unaware of everything. I know. So, Holmes would later confess to murdering Alice and Nellie by forcing them into a large trunk and locking them inside. He had drilled a hole into the lid of the trunk and put one end of a hose through the hole, attaching the other to a gas line to asphyxiate the girls. Very, very sad. He had then buried their nude bodies researchers to be completely aware of what the true backstory of his. But while writing his confessions in prison, he had actually mentioned how drastically his facial appearance had changed since being imprisoned, describing his new grim appearance as gruesome and taking a satanical cast. Weird. What? I know. And he had wrote that after everything that he had done, he was now starting to resemble the devil. Anyway, on May 7th of 1896, Holmes was actually hanged at Moyamensing Prison, also known as the Philadelphia County Prison, for the murder of Paitzell. Until the moment of his death, Holmes had actually remained calm and amiable, showing very few signs of fear, anxiety, or depression. I'd say a little bit of something, though, if he was claiming all of these devil things, but okay. Despite this, he had asked for his coffin to be contained in cement and buried 10 feet deep, because he was concerned grave robbers would steal his body and use it for dissection. Wouldn't that be an interesting twist of fate? Hey. Anyway, so he was hung, but his neck did not snap. No, he instead strangled to death slowly, twitching for over 15 minutes before being pronounced dead. And 20 minutes after the trap had sprung. Upon his execution, his body was interred in a unmarked grave at the Holy Cross Cemetery, a Catholic cemetery in Philadelphia's western suburb of Eden, Pennsylvania. On New Year's 1909, Hedgepeth, whom had been pardoned for informing on Holmes, was shot and killed by the police during a holdup at a Chicago saloon. On March 7th of 1914, the Chicago Tribune had reported the death of Patrick Quinlan, the former caretaker of the castle, which is interesting. I didn't really read about him much, but he must have known